Welcome to the Outdoor Biz Podcast, your home for inspiring conversations with outdoor insiders. Each week, author, speaker, adventurer, and outdoor industry veteran Rick Saez talks in depth with iconic brand founders, sales and marketing pros, product designers, and industry rising stars. Listen in when Rick's guests offer actionable advice to land your ideal industry gig and grow your outdoor career. Catch us again when the conversation shifts to the hottest outdoor products, destinations, and the latest industry insights. And now, here's Rick.
I'm thrilled to host Rob Walch, Libsyn's VP of Podcaster Relations, on the show today. The Outdoor Biz is hosted by Libsyn, and I consistently listen to the Feed podcast from Libsyn with Rob and Libsyn's community manager, Elsie Escobar. Rob and I obviously geek out a bit on podcasting, and Rob shares some small business podcasting success stories and the value publishing a podcast offers small businesses. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Rick, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you. I listen to the Feed regularly, and as we were talking, I've been a Libsyn customer. I've hosted with Libsyn since the get-go. Love all the things you guys do and the info put out, so it's an honor to be talking with you this morning. I appreciate the time.
Well, thanks for listening to the show and for hosting Libsyn. Appreciate it.
You guys do good stuff, yeah. So, to get started, this is an outdoor show, and I got to ask, have you ever been camping? I don't think I've heard you talk about that.
I don't, but here's the thing. I grew up on Long Island, and the first thing you hear, I think of Long Island, people think of New York and cement.
Yeah.
But I actually grew up, literally my house yard was on the fence line for Camp Edie, which is the Girl Scout camp on Long Island. So I grew up next to Camp Edie, and then there was a wildlife preserve behind that. So I grew up with hundreds and hundreds of acres on two, and my house was in the corner of that. So one side was Camp Edie, the other side behind us was the nature preserve, and we had a fence that opened up to go back into the nature preserve.
Wow.
So I grew up with forts and we always had forts back there in the woods, and we were always back there. I lived in the woods growing up.
Right. And all the wildlife, I'm sure that came down with it. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's cool. I have never heard you mention that on the show, on your podcast, on the feed. So that's good to know.
Yeah, but that grew up, and then roughing it became, room service turns off at 9 p.m.
Right. Well, hey, we all have our thing. So tell our listeners a little bit about your background. How'd you get into podcasting? You've been doing it since the get-go, right?
I've been doing it over 17 years.
Wow.
I started in 2004, and it really was as a hobby. I was looking for something to chew up some time. I was traveling a lot for business, and I was looking for something to do when I was on the road. And it was either that or poker, and I chose I chose the P word poker rather than the P word P word podcast rather than poker.
That's smart.
Right. So it was just a right place, right time situation.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. What was your first podcast?
Right. Yeah, my first podcast was Podcast 411.
Yeah.
And I started that in 2004, late 2004, and there was maybe 100 podcasters out there at the time. Wow. And I was like, oh well, I'll interview other podcasters, and maybe there'll be more in the future. And there's quite a bit more than there were in those early days.
Yeah, there's a lot now, yeah. So I usually ask people to give us the Reader's Digest version of something, but I think nobody reads Reader's Digest anymore. So give us the Twitter version of Podcast 411, Today in iOS, Today in Podcasting, and the Feed. Okay,
so Podcast 411 really was inside the Actors Studio, but for podcasting. I loved Inside the Actors Studio, and I just said, you know what, I'm going to do a show kind of like that. I'm going to talk to people that are in it, and not just to find out the technical, but the art side of it, why they're doing their podcast, how they do it, things like that. So some standard questions, but open it up and talk more specific about them. So that was Podcast 101, basically Inside the Actors Studio, but for podcasting. Today in iOS originally started as Today in iPhone, and it was the first podcast about the iPhone. And it, in the Twitter summary, was an excuse for me to buy an iPhone that I could justify for the life. Nice. That's it in a nutshell. It's like, I want the iPhone. How do I justify? Back then, it was a $700 phone, no subsidy in the early days, and that was really expensive for a phone back then. And I'm like, how do I justify this to wife? Oh, I'll do a podcast. And that's how that podcast started. Today in Podcasting was just a bunch of friends getting together and talking about podcasting. Myself, Gary Leland, Dave Jackson, Ray Ortega, and some others, Paul Culligan. So we would just get in together and talk about podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
And then the feed is the podcast that we do, official podcast for Libsyn, which I co-host with Elsie Escobar, and Elsie, or as we call it, future Elsie, does all the production work. and me and Elsie show up, and then we do the show. But I'm just talent on that one. I don't have to do any of the production work.
Gotcha. Yeah, the feed, like I say, I listen to the feed all the time. You guys do a great job of keeping us podcasters updated on, new happenings from Apple and Google and all the places, and it's really informative. So I love that one. I'll have to tap into a couple of those other ones because I was a Mac guy early on, an iPhone guy early on, so I'm sure today an iOS would be interesting, and the other two would be interesting as well. So I'll tap into those. Those are that must keep you busy. And you have a full-time job and kids. How do you do all that?
Well, yeah. Well, today in iOS is down to like a once a month cadence.
Okay.
Today in podcasting and Podcast 101 kind of are in hiatus.
Oh,
so
okay.
the feed is the one that's regularly released at this point.
Gotcha.
The other ones, if you really want to learn about the history of podcasting, Podcast 411, all the episodes are up there. It gives you a real good history of where podcasting was in the early days, pre-Apple getting into it, and then after Apple got into it in a little bit. But you get a much different feel of where podcasting was from that show than you would get today. Today, people don't know much about the history.
It was probably kind of like ham radio back then, wasn't it? Individuals doing it in the garage? Huh.
It was very much that vibe. I mean, on that show, the first question I asked people was, "What was your first computer?" That was just to get it was a sneaky question to get the level of tech
right
that the guest was. By their answer to the question, I knew how geeky or not geeky I could get with them.
Mm-hmm.
If they said, "Oh, some beige box from Dell," I'd be like, "Okay, well, I'm not going to get techie with this person." But if they go, "Oh, it was a Ohio Scientific computer," I'm like, "Oh, this person is total nerd. We can really nerd out."
Right. Well,
so sometimes, simple little questions, let you know where you can get. Just like your question with me, my camping. I'm not going to be able to tell you today's camping gear. We couldn't get into that. I would be like, huh? But I can tell you how to get around the Girl Scout camp and not get in trouble, and borrow one of their Grumman canoes and go canoeing through the lakes when they were off in the off season. We would go through the lakes. We would grab a canoe, and we wouldn't steal it. We would just borrow it, go from one lake to another, and bring it back.
Yeah, online.
We never took it out of the campgrounds, but we probably shouldn't have been on the canoes out there and on the lake on the Grumman canoes.
Well, back then there might not have been the insurance concern, so you were probably fine.
Right.
These days.
But they were really nice Grumman canoes for any of those folks that remember Grumman canoes. They had a whole fleet of Grumman canoes. We would regularly borrow the Grumman.
How many of them? How many guys was it? How many were in your posse?
There was like 3 or 4 of us that would go and do that. My friend Kenny, me and Kenny were the two main ones, and we would go back there and we would get the canoes and we take it from. There was a multiple lakes, so if you actually go and look Camp Edie, you can go look in Google Maps and you'll see a bunch of different separate lakes. And the goal was to see how many lakes we could get the canoe down.
Oh, cool. That's fun. Well, it's funny that you answered it that way because a lot of folks, I asked that question of everybody, how'd you get into the outdoors or outdoor industry? And a lot of folks started in camp or camping with their family. It involves canoes and the old canvas tents. And so you're right in there with everybody else, man. You got it. So give everybody a quick rundown on Libsyn. You guys host a bunch of podcasts. You produce the feed. You guys are just a wealth of knowledge.
Right. I think one thing people need to understand and to explain Libsyn is that when you listen to a podcast in Apple Podcast or Spotify, they're actually not hosting those files. They're being hosted on a third party. So you need a place to host a file and manage your RSS feed. And the RSS feed is what makes all the magic happen. And that's where you come to Libsyn to host the files and manage the RSS feed. And that's what we've been doing since November 2004. We've delivered more downloads for listeners than any other service in the history of podcasting.
Wow.
And we help folks like yourself get the podcast out. And we host podcasts from Microsoft and Google and Oracle and Intel, Consumer Reports and We delivered 4.5 billion downloads from Joe Rogan.
Wow.
So Joe's first 4.5 billion downloads all came from us. That's where we've been. And we have over 75,000 active podcasts that host with us and are delivering content, over 6 million media files that are hosted on our servers. And delivering it also means we can give you statistics. And that's the big thing that people look for beyond just the hosting and the RSS feed management is stats. How did I do? Right? Because you want to know, are people consuming this? Are they downloading it? And that's where Libsyn comes in with really great stats. We've always been considered the industry gold standard for stats. And we give you great information about not just how many downloads you're getting, but geographically where those downloads are coming from. You're getting them from Idaho versus Montana versus New York, and you can find that out.
Or around the world, too. And you guys have a number of places. That's what I love about it, is you can go to Libsyn and then push it out to all these places. So I don't need 6 different feeds going to 6 different places. It's just one-stop shopping. It makes it easy for a podcaster. So, yeah, that's awesome. And you're adding new all the time, Ghana and all the things.
And we just added Samsung. So if you haven't added your show to Samsung yet, go and add your show to Samsung.
I got to get on that.
Yeah. And that's nice because that Samsung Free is the largest native podcast directory out there for an Android device. Oh, okay. So if you haven't added your podcast to Samsung, definitely want to do that if you're hosting on Libsyn.
Definitely. I'll do that today. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah. And podcast growth doesn't appear to be slowing. I mean, there's all kinds of folks that are starting new podcasts. There's really some creative shows out there. What's that look like to you guys? Do you see people continuing to enjoy?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the consumer point of view, there's more and more people listening to podcasts now than ever before. And we joke now and just say, it's at a point where you can just say to your listeners, just listen to this podcast anywhere you consume audio. Mm-hmm. And it really has become that ubiquitous. You can listen on Spotify. You can listen, obviously, in Apple Podcasts, which is the biggest. But you can listen in Ghana and Deezer and Geo7. These are music-first services that are now have podcast directories. So all the top music directories, globally, now have podcasting. So you've got TuneIn, you've got on top of that, you've got iHeartRadio, and what was radio.com is now Odyssey. These are all different places you can get your podcast out to. So it's really easy to distribute your podcast to where people are already listening to audio. And that's the big difference, in podcasting versus, say, YouTube. Mm-hmm. Podcasting is mostly audio, and there's just more time in the day to consume audio. You can be out hiking, right, and canoeing and other things and listening to a podcast while you're doing this.
And how have podcasts evolved in the previous 5 years or so? I'm seeing some pretty creative shows come out there now with, educational and I was telling somebody the other day, I said, heck, you could do a trail guide on the Pacific Crest Trail and walk someone from south to north on the PCT. It'd be a long show, but you could do it,
Well, here's the thing, there's always been sound seeing tours. People have been doing that there was one back in 2005. That was someone was doing sound seeing. So really, it's just more of the content is available and people are getting more access to it. As far as the originality of what's being released, I don't consider another true crime podcast that original. There's plenty of those. So there's more, every niche and genre you can think of has a podcast. There's a podcast for backyard beekeeping. There's a podcast for professional breeders of chameleons, right? So if you're a chameleon breeder, you can not someone that owns chameleons, but if you breed chameleons, there's a podcast for you. And that's the beauty of podcasting. You can really dig into the niche. And I think the biggest mistake people get when they look at podcasting is they try to compare it to radio, when you really should be comparing it to magazines. Because podcasts are really not meant for a broad audience. They're meant for a niche audience, just like a magazine. And, for outdoor business, as you cover, that's great. No matter what product someone has, no matter what niche they're into, if it is someone that's just focusing on canoes, you can have a podcast about that.
Yep.
You can have a podcast on canoeing, and you can talk about all the great places to go canoeing in the country, and just that niche, not about anything else, not about kayaking, not about just focusing on open, classic Grumman canoes. You can talk about where can I take my Grumman canoes. You can have a podcast on that.
Yep, yep. And niching down, I think, also helps me as a podcaster, because as people approach me with guests, it's pretty easy for me to say yes or no, because if they're in the outdoor industry but they're related to some Frisbee outdoors or something, that's outdoor recreation and sports. That's not my show. It's easy for me to control that content.
And there are plenty of outdoor Frisbee podcasts, by the way.
Are there really?
So you can point them over to, you can say, hey, there are plenty of Frisbee golf podcasts and other ones that you can go and hit on.
That's good to know.
Because they are covered.
That. Yeah. I'm sure everything by now is covered via a podcast somehow. Maybe not, but it's got to be.
Right. And the beauty is you don't have to have a large audience to be successful. Right? The one that has the Chameleon Breeder, believe it or not, that podcast, which is a real podcast, it has almost 800 listeners per episode. Think about that. How many people are going to be interested in breeding chameleons worldwide? And this guy's got 800 of them.
Right. You
want to talk about a successful show. Now people go, it's not tens of thousands. No, but you're not trying to get Harry's Razors as your advertiser in that situation.
Right.
And many times you're creating the podcast. You're not trying to get an advertiser at all. Your podcast is the advertisement. And if you do it well, and let me define well for a niche podcast: 95% content, 5% promotion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good number.
And if you do that, where the focus is on the content and just a little bit self-promotion, your audience will be more than happy with that little bit of self-promotion. But if people flip it, and I've heard it flipped, 95 promotion and 5% content, and I've come across a couple of those.
Wow.
The numbers are pitiful and the return is horrible.
Yeah.
And so it's not worth it. But if you can get it the other way, you can have a very successful show that people will gladly mention and promote to their friends and family and other people in their peers in their industry. And
that's my audience is pretty good with that. I have a pretty niche audience, and it's hardcore focus. And my shtick is really, I just want to share. The outdoor industry has been so good to me, and it's been so good to so many other people. And there's so many interesting stories that all these people have. I mean, I've said this many times. We go to these trade shows a couple times a year, and they're like high school reunions for those of us that have been around a while. And there's backslaps and hugs and beers, and some of the stories that get told in the aisles. It just, you may never hear them again. So that's kind of how I started my show. So no, you're spot on there.
So I need to ask, since you started the show, these conventions you go to, have you been asked to speak now that you have a podcast?
I was asked to speak once there. I gave a couple webinars at the Outdoor Writers Conference. So yeah, I've spoke around a little bit about podcasting. Mm-hmm.
And that's the beauty of podcasting. I hear that from others is when you start doing a podcast and you go to the conventions, you start becoming the speakers. It's one thing to have a blog, but when you have a podcast, people don't realize that the small number of podcasters there are versus bloggers. There's like 750 million blogs out there. There's less than 500,000 active podcasts.
Wow.
So you become more niche. And the people that run these conventions and shows, when we get back to trade shows and in-person stuff, if you want to have a speaker, you don't know if that person's going to be a good speaker when you read their blog, but you do know if they're going to be a good speaker if you listen to their podcast.
Right.
And I get that all the time from folks that they're now asked to run panels. Yeah. Hey, we want to have you run a panel on this session.
A couple times, yeah.
We saw your right. And this is just some great opportunities in your niche to become even more of an expert because you have a podcast or perceived expert.
Yeah. And the Outdoor Writers Association of America, a group I belong to, started years ago. I mean, it's been around for, 50, 80 years, long time. But it's always been, articles, magazine writers, book writers, authors, photographers, and they've just now started to embrace podcasting. I gave a webinar on podcasting, 2 webinars at their last conference. So that's another portion of outdoor media, right? It's podcasting. So it's an opportunity for not only writers and authors, but brands. Let's talk a little bit about, shift gears and talk about your thoughts on the value of publishing a podcast for small businesses.
Well, this again comes back to sticking in your niche. You're being able to hit a really targeted audience, especially if you have a small business that's geared in a niche. And you can try to go out and find the right demographics to promote your product, or you can start a podcast and get the right psychographics. And again, psychographics is much better return on investment than demographics. And psychographics means it's the topic people are interested in versus demographics, which is, people between the ages of 18 and 35 might be into camping, and a certain tiny percent of them will, and right. Or you could actually just find people that really are into camping by having a podcast on that niche of camping and wherever it is that your niche, your business focuses on, and have target your audience. It's really about what does your audience want and giving them content around that. And then, by the way, I've got this product.
Yeah, exactly. And for a small outdoor shop that's got a number of products, like you said, you can have a podcast on just canoeing, but if you're an outdoor shop that does canoeing and hiking and climbing and all just camping, you can do stoves and boots and everything that your customer is going to need to go hiking or camping or canoeing. So yeah. And how does the customer or listener benefit from that? Those niche
the beauty of podcasting is it's, if done right, it's educational and hopefully entertaining. The podcasts that are the most successful are the ones that are both entertaining and educational. You can be successful with just one or the other. If you want to be really successful, you have to have both. And podcasting saves people time. Rather than having to go and read a bunch of blogs to get information, now someone can listen when they're in their car driving to and from work. They can be listening when they're out doing yard work. They can be listening walking the dog. They could be listening walking the Appalachian Trail. Right? This is the beauty of podcasting, just more time in the day to consume it. Mm-hmm. And that's where you have to hit your audiences when other mediums aren't able to. You drive in the car, you can't be watching a YouTube video.
You better not be.
Yeah. Even the Teslas, folks, you read all the stories about, right? Yeah, I wouldn't risk that, right? So, autonomous vehicles are not as autonomous as they're still trying to kill us. The machines, it's people don't realize it. The revolution has started.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. It's more time in the day, and you can't always, I say that a lot, you can't always read the magazine or watch the YouTube video, but man, they can always stick an earbud in their ear and listen to you talk. So,
yep.
Yeah. Do you have any small business podcast success stories or specific tactics you can share with us?
Well, again, one of the success stories would be the Chameleon Breeder podcast, and then the Backyard Beekeepers, and these are small niche podcasts that have garnered a good sized audience that allowed them to monetize. Glenn Herbert's another one who's got one on horses, and he's got a whole network on horses. And a lot of these folks, that's where they're making their money from that, from the podcast is their main revenue generation, not via ads, but via leads. It's lead gen, and people come in and are finding that. So, and what all of these have done is they didn't come into it from day one thinking I'm going to monetize on day one, or they had a long-term plan. They did it for years and now are very successful, and they stuck with it. And they understood that, hey, when you start out, you may only have 50 or 100 people listening. And then it gets to 150 and then to 200 and to 500. Right? But even 250 people listening to your podcast day in or week in and week out, think about if you go to a trade show and you go and speak to an audience, how many people are in that room? If you're lucky, 50, maybe 100. If you got a really good packed room, you might have 200. And then how many of those 200 that are in that room are there for the session after you, or are on their phone or computer answering emails? Whereas these 200, if you have 200 listening to your podcast week in, week out, are listening to your podcast. And they are, it's not just 1 week, it's week in, week out. And I would say to someone, how much would you spend money to go to a trade show to speak to one session. People will spend thousands of dollars to send someone to a trade show, and so that they have the ability to speak in a room where they get 150 people that may be paying attention.
Right.
Whereas they do a podcast, they can get an audience bigger than that, week in, week out, that really is actually interested in the content.
Mm-hmm. And you go into a room with 200-300 people, and that's a crowd. It's like, whoa, that's a lot of people there. Yeah.
Right. And again, Community Breeder podcast, 800. That's a huge room.
A huge crowd.
That's a keynote. That's the keynote room.
Yeah, exactly.
So that podcasting can be very successful with less than 500 people listening to the podcast, and for businesses.
And do you have any advice for folks wanting to start a podcast?
Absolutely. What is it that you are passionate about? What is your business? Make sure you pick the topic that you are going to want to talk about, because again, to be successful, it's about long term. And if you don't want to talk about Grumman Canoes, don't start a Grumman Canoe podcast. If if you're like, oh, well, I think people will be interested in this. This is a good idea, but I've never even used one. I don't have one. Now I'm going to go have to do research about it, and you're going to burn out. And before you make it to 10 episodes, you're going to be like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. So you have to pick something that, people always say, what's a good topic for me to do a podcast on? I go, well, what are you listening to? What podcasts are you listening to? What are you reading? What articles do you, or sites do you go to that you have pinged?
Right.
What are you consuming media-wise? That topic. Well, someone already has a podcast on that. Well, that doesn't mean you can't have one. I always joke, I Dream a Genie and the Munsters, great television shows, but really they were Bewitched and the Addams Family.
Yep. That's true.
But it doesn't take away from the fact that I Dream a Genie was still a great show, and the Munsters was a great show. So you can have a show that's the same topic, same genre, but it's your personality. It's going to bring a different feel to it. So don't worry that there's already another show on that topic. You're going to bring a different feel to it. And there's plenty of time in the week for people to listen to both shows.
Yeah. Well, plenty of time. Yeah, exactly. And multiple shows, right? There's a lot of outdoor podcasts, and people can listen to a different one every day and, catch them regularly. Some of them aren't weekly, but yeah, there's all kinds of different cadences and opportunities. And yeah, you're spot on there. And do you have a favorite piece of podcast gear under $100?
Samsung, not Samsung, Samsung Q2U microphone.
Okay.
If you're starting out podcasting, it's a great little mic to start with. You can get an adapter. You can plug it right into an iPhone or an Android phone. And it's an XLR and a USB mic. So again, you can plug it into your phone, but if you graduate up to higher end gear where you have a mixer, or maybe you buy a Zoom H6 digital recorder in the future, you can plug it into that as well. So it's a very versatile mic. It's a great microphone to start out with. If you're going to go to trade shows and interview people at trade shows, you can, again, plug it right into your iPhone. You can record from your iPhone right onto one of the apps, right from the mic, and you can go in and interview somebody at a trade show. And by the way, if you're going to go to trade shows and interview people, never hand the mic to like the VP of sales and marketing of some company. You will not get it back. So hold on to the mic, do a one mic interview, and that way you can control the interview.
That's good advice. I never thought of that, but I never hand the mic to anybody ever. I don't know why, but that's a good one.
Yeah, you got to be careful. If you're going booth to booth and you're going to do interviews at a trade show, you just don't hand over the mic, because some of these people, they have this pitch and it's ready to go. And the pitch is absolutely nothing to do with what you asked.
Right.
But no matter what you ask, they're going to give you the pitch.
Yeah, you'll never get it back.
And you got to hold that mic, and you got to control it, and you got to be able to say, okay, I want to ask you this. And then they start going off on their rant. You pull it back. Okay, but that's nice. But let's talk about this. And just control that interviews. But
and they launch right back in.
Right. That's, you can buy it on Amazon, usually $65, $70.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes.
For the mic.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of replaced the ATR 2100.
It's better than the ATR 2100 in the respect that it has less hand noise.
Oh, okay. That's good to know, yeah.
So the ATR 2100 is a really bad hand noise, which means when you're holding the microphone, you can hear it. Any movement of your hand on the mic comes through. The Samsung QTU is not nearly as sensitive.
Okay, because I have ATR 2100s. I'll have to pick up a couple of those Q2Us. Most of my stuff, when I do it at trade shows, though, I try to sit down with someone in a booth or someone on a panel. I've done that kind of thing, which it's their mic and their equipment. But yeah, that's a good one. As we wrap up here, is there anything else you'd like to ask or say of our listeners?
The biggest thing I mentioned is make sure if you start a podcast, it's something you really are passionate about. Podcasting is more work than blogging. That's why there's 750 million blogs and only 500,000 podcasts.
Right.
But the return on podcasting is greater because you're not competing with all those bot blogs that are out there. You're competing with real, actual humans. And it is a niche medium. Don't think of it like radio. Think of it like magazines. And if you are going to do a podcast on a niche and you want to actually understand who the advertisers potentially could be, if you are looking for advertisers, you can go to magazines in that niche and see who's advertising there and ask them to be sponsors for your podcast. If you're going to do one on fly fishing, you're going to do a podcast on fly fishing. There's a lot of fly fishing magazines you can go pick through and find advertisers in those magazines to come and sponsor your podcast. But don't worry about getting too niche either. If it's something you're really passionate about, if you're the only, and here's the beauty, if you get real niche, you'll become the only place those potential folks can go to sponsor.
Yeah, and then you'll be the expert on that specific topic, and you'll for sure get asked to speak at conferences and whatnot. Yeah, no, that's good. And if people would like to follow up with you, what's the best way to reach out to Rob?
Easiest way is Rob, R-O-B as in Robert, Rob at Libsyn, Libsyn, stands for Liberated Syndication, but Rob at Libsyn.com.
Cool. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes
too. That's the easiest way.
Awesome. Well, Rob, thanks for your time this morning. I appreciate it. I always learn a little bit when I listen to you and Elsie, so I'll continue to do that. And one day I look forward to meeting you at a trade show if we ever go to them again.
I hope we do. I really do. Yeah. And I look forward to meeting you at a future trade show. And Rick, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Outdoor Biz Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theoutdoorbizpodcast.com, where you'll find show notes with links to everything we talked about and more. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or spread the word and tell a friend about the show. That would really help us out too. Be sure to tune in every week. And thanks again for listening to the Outdoor Biz Podcast with Rick Saez.